Welcome everybody to our Eco Talk series. The theme of the Eco Talk is decolonizing the Earth. Okay, and this is our last talk for this semester. And I'm so happy and so thrilled to have Professor Loy to come to our series. And the talk is Ecosattva. And some of the students just learned the term bodhisattva, and now we have a little bit spin on it, Ecosattva. And we'll hear what Professor Loy say about, ecological bodhisattva in our current time of climate crisis, and how, what kind of Buddhist practice or any kind of religious practice should be a more socially engaged form of sanghas or community should be like. So let me give you a little bit of biography, very brief bio about Professor Loy. He is a professor of Buddhist and comparative philosophy, a prolific writer, and a teacher in the Senbo Zen tradition of Japanese Buddhism. And I'm curious about the Senbo Zen, because I never heard of that myself. I belong to the Rinzai tradition. Anyway, his many books include A New Buddhist Path, and most recently, Eco-Dharma, again, another sort of spin on the word Dharma. Eco-Dharma, Buddhist teachings for the ecological crisis. And he is especially concerned about social and ecological issues. In addition to offering workshops, meditation retreats, he is one of the founders of the Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center near Boulder, Colorado. And in June 2014, Professor Loy received an honorary degree from Carleton College, his alma mater, during its 2014 commencement. And in April 2016, Professor Lloyd returned this degree to protest the decision of the board of trustees not to divest from fossil fuel investment. We should all learn from this. And I also saw the news, Professor Lloyd, like a while back, you were arrested, right? When you were protesting with yeah, I saw the picture of it when I was doing some research, and so that's very touching to see a model of a Buddhist activist. At least it's for me. And now let me introduce our today's respondent. It's Professor Stephen Rowley. He's a professor of Asian Studies at the University of San Francisco. His research has been focused on intersections between institutional change, literary expression, and ethnographic knowledge in late pre-modern China and Japan. And recent publications include a translation of a 1651 Chuanqi drama on the theme of female same-sex love, scented soulmates, and the study of poetry and prose of the to late Qing dynasty. And one of the connection, I think, Professor Rowdy to this talk is also because he has one of the his chapter in a book that I added. It's Chinese Environmental Humanities, and also, as far as I know, when Professor Rowdy was young, right? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And that was like, what is it, 3 miles? What is it in Philadelphia? That was the clear strike.
3 Mile Island. Yes. Yes, I was a little bit involved in the movement that grew up out of reaction to that, basically.
Right. And so as far as I know, Professor Rowdy has been always very, environmentalist in terms of thinking and writing and, participation in the conferences and so on. So anyway, I'll stop here, and let's welcome Professor Loy for today's talk. Okay, please take it away.
Thank you, Professor Chang. And first of all, thank you for this invitation and your very warm introduction. Almost every day recently, I remember something that Noam Chomsky said a few years ago. Noam Chomsky, the American intellectual and critic. Um, in September of 2020, he gave an interview in which he said that right now, well, let me quote him exactly. The world is at the most dangerous moment in human history, owing to the climate crisis, the threat of nuclear war, and rising authoritarianism. There's been nothing like it in human history, he said. I'm old enough to remember vividly the threat of Nazism, but even that, horrible enough, was not like the end of organized human life on Earth, which is what we may be facing. Chomsky said that in 2020, which was sort of almost the height of the COVID pandemic, but it's interesting that he didn't talk about the pandemic at all. He talked, first of all, about the climate crisis. And frankly, it seems to me things are even worse than he is referring to. Um, I don't like to talk about the climate crisis because that's just the tip of a much larger ecological challenge, right? That includes many other issues, such as the fact that we seem to be in the middle of a great extinction event when a very large percentage of plant and animal species are disappearing. Um, there's enormous loss of topsoil, of forestry. On average, 250 trees in the world are cut down every second. 8 acres become desert every minute. 5 tons of soil are washed away, destroyed every second. And I mean, there are just so many issues here. Toxins, unhealthy chemicals are found everywhere, even in mother's milk. But basically, they're in the air, they're in the water, then they're in the earth, they're in our bodies, they're found in the North Pole and the South Pole. So the ecological crisis is actually much greater than just um, the climate, although naturally we tend to focus on that. You know, Chomsky also talked about the danger of nuclear war, and this was before Russia invaded Ukraine. I think things have become a lot more dangerous since then. Uh, and he talked about the decline of democracy. I remember I'm old enough that I grew up when there was a real sense of progress, that the world was getting better, that democracy was spreading. But in fact, over the last decade or so, that's really been reversed. We can see how more authoritarian regimes have been established in many places, right? India, mainland China, um, Russia, Turkey, several countries in other countries in Europe and South America. Anyway, you get the idea. And add to this the extraordinary gap between rich and poor, which is still growing, to the point that right now, approximately 1% of the world's richest people basically own about 50% of the world's wealth. 1% owns about 50%. And on the other side, the bottom 50%, the poorest 50% of the world's population, almost 4 billion now, they collectively own only about 1% world's wealth. I mean, we can go on and on about this, but I think you can see the point that we are indeed, as Chomsky says, this is an extremely dangerous moment in human history. And I invite you to consider, if you put all this together, including all the things I don't have time to go into, I think we seem to have a civilization that has lost its way. it seems ironic that in the last century or so, we have finally attained a truly worldwide civilization, and it seems to be self-destructing. And of course, the question comes up, the question for this talk, what should we do in response to this dangerous situation? Here I am reminded of a couple Chan or Zen stories. In one of them, the student asked the master, "What should we do when difficult times come?" And the master answered, this is kind of hard to show on the screen, but embrace them, welcome them. You can say our path, the Buddhist path, the spiritual path, is not about evading difficulties, but welcoming them. And in fact, it's often times that are the most difficult, that are the most transformative, when we find that we are most challenged and end up changing the most. The second Zen story involved Chan Master Yun Men. One of his students asked him, "What is the fruit of a lifetime of practice? What do we learn from that?" And he responded by saying, "Responding appropriately." We learn to respond appropriately. A wonderful answer, reminding us that the Chan, the Zen path, isn't about trying to transcend this world, to go to some other reality, but rather transcend our usual experience in a way that we can more fully engage with what's happening in the world. But that still just raises the question, how do we respond appropriately to such an extraordinarily dangerous polycrisis with so many aspects to it? What does Buddhism have to offer that can help us understand and respond appropriately? One answer, I think, is maybe not very much, right? The Buddha lived, what, maybe 2,400 years ago in a very different time and place, Iron Age India. And certainly the eco problems that we face today, they were not on his mind. And so it's not surprising that, we can look at all of the Buddhist texts, the sutras and so forth, and we're not going to find specific answers of what we should do in response to the situation that we're facing right now. But nonetheless, there are really important implications built in. I think we can extrapolate, we can take fundamental Buddhist principles and see how they might apply to this situation. And what I'd like to do in this talk is actually focus on one particular Buddhist teaching that I think is, frankly, the single most important teaching that Buddhism has to offer us today. And it's the Bodhisattva path, or as I sometimes call it, the new Bodhisattva path, because I think we need to understand it a little bit differently. And sometimes we talk about the Ecosattva path to emphasize that the Bodhisattva path, it needs to engage with the ecological crisis. And so what I'd like to do in my talk is emphasize three aspects of the new Bodhisattva or Ecosattva path. The first is simply to emphasize that bodhisattvas have a double practice, a two-sided practice, like a coin. In a way, this is the most basic thing about what they're doing. They continue to work on their own personal transformation, right? On their own awakening. And yet they're also aware that this is insufficient, that we need to be engaged in the world. We need to help others because guess what? They're not really other. We're not separate from them. And when we really look more closely at this two-sided path, I think we can see that each side needs the other if it's going to be as effective, as successful as we need it to be. For example, consider what it's like for an eco-activist. It's a tough job. It's a tough role, right? And there's obviously going to be a lot of frustration built into that. Anger, depression, fatigue, burnout. I think it's very hard to avoid that, and to some degree. And that's why if bodhisattvas can ground their activism in some kind of contemplative practice, some kind of meditation, that can be extraordinarily helpful in helping them cope with the inevitable frustrations that occur when we are engaged in this kind of activism. But it also works on the other side. I think it's still the case that acknowledging the importance of social engagement is still a very big step for many Buddhists, because we have usually been taught to focus on our own minds, our own awakening, our own personal transformation, right? Our own peace of mind. And of course, there's a danger that goes along with that, in the sense that we might become attached to serenity, or, as we say sometimes, clinging to emptiness, uh, in a way that encourages us to become indifferent to what's happening in the world. And in a way, I can see why this tendency is there. If we ask ourselves, why do we come to something like Buddhist meditation? It's because there's some frustration, there's some dissatisfaction, some dukkha, to use the Buddhist term, some dukkha in our lives. Our lives aren't working as well as we would like them to. And so inevitably, when we come to the meditation, there's going to be a certain kind of self-preoccupation. We want to understand what's going on in our minds, why, how are we making ourselves unhappy, and so forth, right? So there's a natural self-preoccupation there. But here's what's really interesting. As we pursue the meditative path, there comes a point when we realize that at the core of the problem for us is really the delusion of a separate self. Seeing through the delusion that there's a me inside, and you, all of you, and the rest of the world is outside. And as long as we have that delusion, we can think, well, my own well-being is separate from the well-being of other people. But insofar as that core delusion, that preoccupation always with improving, trying to resolve the problem of the self, that preoccupation becomes self-defeating after a while. It ends up actually reinforcing the sense of a separate self, which is the problem. Whereas we start to realize that at the core of the solution is engagement with others, engagement with the world, compassionate commitment, concern about the well-being of others, of everyone, of the earth. And when that happens, we realize that our engagement, our social, ecological engagement with the earth, that's not a distraction from our practice, but in a fundamental way, it's an essential part of it. Franz Kafka, the Czech writer, in a letter he wrote, "You can hold back from the sufferings of the world. That is something you are free to do. But perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering you could have avoided." Interesting. We can hold back from the sufferings of others, but what he's saying, that holding back is itself a suffering. Again, because it reinforces the delusion of a separate self that is somehow going to make itself happy. Whereas there's a fundamental suffering built into that delusion of separate self. Here I'm reminded of really my all-time favorite quotation of all time, literally. And it's not even by a Buddhist, it's by a Neo-Vedantin named Nisargadatta. But I think he really captures the spirit here better than anyone else I know. This is what he said: "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that is wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that is love. Between these two, my life flows." I think that's very beautiful, very powerful. And it also points to really the two pillars of the Buddhist path, right? Wisdom and compassion. And he shows the relationship between them, right? Love, the kind of love and compassion he's talking about, it's not a feeling, but it's a way of living. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of relating to other people and the world that follows from this realization of our non-duality with it. I think many Buddhists, many of us still have sometimes a kind of romanticized myth about the path of meditation. For example, in Tibetan Buddhism, there's the most famous of all yogis, Milarepa. I mean, supposedly he walled himself up in a cave. I think his skin turned green because he ate nettles to survive. And he meditated and supposedly went all the way to Buddhahood in one lifetime, right? Well, I wonder about that. I'm reminded of something Joanna Macy said. The world has a role to play in our awakening. The world, our relationship with the world, that has a role. And I'm reminded of, at the very beginning of my own Zen practice, I was living in the Maui Zendo in Hawaii. I have to say, a pretty nice place to practice. Not very strictly Japanese, but we were serious. Most of us were sort of hippies at that point, but we were very serious about our practice. And there were a lot of openings, what might be called kensho, little glimpses of enlightenment. But the real challenge many of us discovered was not having those openings through meditation, but actually integrating them into how actually we relate to other people. That was the greater challenge. I'm reminded too of something Ram Dass said, very important Hindu teacher or teacher of Hinduism. He said, "So, you think you're enlightened, right? Well, go spend the holidays with your family. See how you get along with everyone, how you find out just how transformed you are. See how easy it is to fall back into old ways of relating." Ram Dass also talked about the path of meditation as a kind of self-sharpening tool, right? We meditate, and then in our engagement with other people in the world, we see where we're still stuck. We still see where the problems are. And then when we come back to the meditation, we have a better sense of what we need to work on. Basically, the whole point of this is to emphasize that engagement with the world's problems is not, therefore, a distraction from our own spiritual path, but an essential part of it. And we can say, I think, that when a bodhisattva is engaged in the world, the person who benefits most from that engagement usually is the bodhisattva herself. Robert Thurman, a very important Tibetan Buddhist scholar, he likes to say, practice, practice, practice. People are always talking about practice. What I want to know is, when is the performance? And what I love about that is, the realization that the practice and the performance are not two separate things. It turns out that our performance, our action in the world, is an essential part of our practice. One of the great Japanese teachers, Kukai or Kobodaishi, I think he summed this up so well when he said, "The measure of our enlightenment is how we serve others." So again, the two aspects, the two sides of the path reinforce each other. Meditation, continuing our own meditation practice and engagement in the world, they really work very well together. Let me move on now to the second point. I sometimes talk about this bodhisattva path as the new bodhisattva path, because frankly, I think today we have a deeper and better understanding of dukkha. And by dukkha, I think most of you know, this is the original Pali Sanskrit term for suffering. But we have to understand it in the broadest possible sense, not just physical, mental pain, but dissatisfaction, frustration, anxiety, dis-ease, basically our inability to live as happily as we would like. Fundamental dukkha. And of course, this is what the Buddha was talking about. Right, Four Noble Truths, the most common summary, they're all about life is dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, nibbana, and the Eightfold Path to end dukkha. And the Buddha had said very explicitly that all he taught, the only thing he taught was dukkha and how to end dukkha, right? It's interesting, though, the way that in the Buddhist tradition, dukkha has usually been understood on the individual personal level, right? Somehow the idea that if we've got some real problematic dukkha, it must be because of our karma, it must be because of something we did in a past lifetime, and therefore sort of not to blame anyone else for anything that happened. Actually, I think the Buddha himself was a lot more progressive, I suspect this, more progressive than the tradition that developed after he died. When you look at his attitude toward women and caste, right? I mean, he created a sangha for bhikkhuni, right? For women, because he realized that women basically have the same Buddha nature, the same potential to awaken as men. I mean, obviously today we take that for granted, but 2,400 years ago in India, I don't think that was such a common realization, right? In the Vedic tradition, women normally were not allowed to chant or engage in any spiritual practices. And also his idea about caste, that when someone joined the Sangha, they lost caste, kind of the equivalent of sort of racism today. So, that implies something I think really powerful about his understanding of dukkha, I think, and maybe some of the social causes of dukkha. But it's interesting that after the Buddha died, frankly, the new cult of Buddhism, I think it lost a lot of that progressive tendency, right? First of all, in order to survive and thrive and grow, it wanted royal support, and so it didn't want to challenge the social structure at all. It tended to sort of go along. It encouraged kings. It didn't want to challenge the authority of the king. In fact, according to the karma teaching, if someone becomes a king, they obviously must have very good karma, so we should respect that. But then today we have this problem, the way that karma is understood, again, solely in this individual fashion. And I remember once hearing a Tibetan teacher saying, "Oh, what terrible karma all of those Jewish people in Nazi Europe must have had in order to be born at that time," right? What terrible karma, individual karma from past lifetimes. And I think that that's really unacceptable. I don't think that we should allow that to pass anymore. I can understand according to a certain way of thinking, but I think we need to go beyond that thinking and acknowledge that people can get caught up in social forces and social movements. And, for many of the Jewish people in Germany and Europe, it didn't matter how fine they were. Unfortunately, many of them ended their lives in concentration camps nonetheless, right? So I think we need to understand karma in a much broader say. Let me try to get at this in a different fashion. Unlike the Abrahamic religions like Judaism and Christianity and Islam, in Buddhism, the primary issue isn't good versus evil. That's not the main thing going on. Rather, it's much more cognitive in the deepest sense of there's something that we need to realize, there's something that we need to understand, not just in a conceptual sense, but more deeply, something we need to experience. But the Buddha also talked more specifically about the causes of dukkha, suffering, and he picked out, the three poisons, which many of us or most of us are familiar with, right? The three poisons, sometimes called the three fires or even the three roots of evil, three poisons of greed, ill will, and delusion. And the basic idea is that when what we do is motivated by one or more of these poisons, it's going to create suffering. It's going to create bad karma. It's going to create problems. What is new about our situation today, and what I think we need to acknowledge and emphasize, is that the three poisons aren't simply individual problems, but actually today they have become institutionalized. They have taken a collective form. And we need to acknowledge that and find ways to work against that. What do I mean by institutionalized three poisons? Well, what about institutionalized greed? Let me be quite frank here. I think our economic system, you can call it what, corporate consumer capitalism, I think that's a very good example of institutionalized greed. If greed means you never have enough, you always want more, well, that's a pretty good description of the way this economic system works. Advertising to keep persuading us to consume more and more. It's always the next thing we buy that's going to make us happy. In fact, to be quite frank here, I think consumerism is really the most popular religion these days in the modern world. If we understand religion as teaching us, what's really important about the world and how to live in it, I think, for more and more people, consumerism is the answer to that question, right? But also think about the way corporations work, right? Corporations are structured in a way that legally they're required to maximize profit for their shareholders. If you're a corporation, you always want more profit, you want more market share, you want higher share prices. It's never enough. But then there's this question, why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? That seems to be the kind of rut we get stuck into. Again, collective institutionalized greed. What about institutionalized ill will? Well, I think we can see how that comes out in a lot of ways. First of all, in our militarism. Now, as an American, I think it's important for me to acknowledge that if you look at the amount of money that the US puts into its military, we are the most militarized society in the history of the world, right? Every year, the world spends now, I think it's $1.7 trillion, maybe more, and approximately half of that is done by the US alone, for war or preparation for war or helping other countries like Ukraine and Israel that are engaged in war. But if you think about ill will, you can also broaden that to think about tribalism, to think about racism, to think about nationalism and how powerful those forces still are, where we as a group feel separate from another group, and we're concerned, to work for the benefit of our group at the expense of that group, and so often the kind of ill will, the aggression that goes along with that. And finally, what about institutionalized delusion, the third poison? When I first thought about this, I really emphasized advertising as, controlling how we think, what we want. But of course, in the last few years, with the growth of the internet and political propaganda, I think we also have to acknowledge the role of fake news in, fake news attempting to control what we think how we vote, who we support, right? Fake news is, I mean, so delusion isn't just on the individual level. It's that actually there are strong forces in our societies that attempt to delude us, and we need to acknowledge and we need to ask ourselves, how can we respond appropriately to that? How do we respond appropriately to institutionalized greed, ill will, and delusion? One of the interesting things that's happened in the US over the last generation, you know, since I started practicing Buddhism, I think there has been more realization, more emphasis on um, the importance of bodhisattva type activities, social engagement, right? I think that realization is very strong, but it is still, for the most part, on the level of individuals helping other individuals. That's still the understanding, I think, for the most part. Um, it's as if we have become much better at pulling drowning people out of the river that's flowing by very quickly. We're better at pulling them out of the river, but actually, we're still not very good at asking, well, why are there so many more people drowning in the river? Who or what is pushing them in upstream, right? I mean, on the Buddhists are more involved in sort of helping homeless people, kitchens, prison dharma, um, hospice work, again, helping individuals. But when it comes to addressing these institutionalized three poisons, this is still new and something we're going to have to develop. Um, I'm reminded of something Bill McKibben, you know, one of the really, he was founder of 350.org. He's one of the really important eco activists in the US. And when he was in Paris a few years ago for one of the COPs, you know, somebody asked him, what can I do as an individual? And his response was very interesting. He said, stop being an individual. Stop being an individual. Easy to misunderstand, I think. I mean, on the individual level, yeah, we need to do things like reducing our own carbon footprint. But his point is a very important one, that the problems we're facing are not just individual, but they're institutionalized. And that means in order to address them, we have to come together. We have to create stronger sanghas, stronger communities than we have been able to do so far. We need to work together more. So that's the second point, the emphasis on um, the new bodhisattva path, a deeper understanding, I think, of dukkha and how it's functioning today and what that challenge means for us. But let me finish, or, well, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but let me move to the third point, the final point that I want to make, um, which is simply that the bodhisattva path does not tell us what to do, but it does tell us a lot about how to do it. You know, the fact that it doesn't tell us what to do, well, I already alluded to that earlier. The Buddhism, for the Buddha and in Asian Buddhism, it didn't face the problems we're facing. So it's not surprising it doesn't tell us what to do. But nonetheless, there are still very fundamental Buddhist principles that are very relevant here. Of course, traditionally, the Bodhisattva path involves developing paramitas, certain types of perfections, character traits, qualities that we develop to the highest possible degree. And the six primary ones are usually generosity, ethical behavior, patience, persistence, some kind of contemplative practice, and finally, wisdom. That's the traditional, those are the traditional qualities that we develop on the Bodhisattva path. But I want to focus on something else. Because I think none of those gets at what is most distinctive and I think most powerful about spiritual activism. And it is simply this, that bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results of their action. Let me say that again. Bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results. If we go back to the Pali Canon, the Buddha says that the actions of an awakened person are nirasa, without expectation. And in the Lojong teaching, one of the aphorisms of Tibetan Buddhism, it says, abandon all hope or expectation of fruition. Don't get caught up in how you will be in the future. Stay in the present moment. And this principle isn't only found in Buddhism. For example, in the Bhagavad Gita, maybe the most popular of all Hindu texts, right? In the Gita, it talks about different paths to God, different spiritual practices. And one of them is karma yoga, the path of action. And the emphasis there is, again, exactly the same thing. Your right is to the work, never to the fruits. So again, acting, doing what we can, but not attachment to the results. Now, a very big question comes up here. How does that accord with the kind of social and ecological activism that's necessary today? Because there's the danger of a kind of misunderstanding here. Acting without attachment can easily be misunderstood, I think, especially because Buddhism emphasizes so much on our motivation, our intention. And so we might think, it doesn't matter whether what I do has any consequences. It's what's really important is the purity of my intention, right? My pure motivation. I can see the attraction of that, but I think it's a profoundly dangerous misunderstanding. So let me continue by kind of unpacking what non-attachment to results really means. Let me start with the distinction between running a 100-meter dash race and running a marathon. A 100-meter dash, you don't have time to think about anything else except getting to the goal line as quickly as possible. But you can't run a marathon like that because you will burn yourself out really quickly, right? A marathon is what, 26 miles? I mean, you've really got to pace yourself. You've got to not just go all out, right? It's important to pace yourself. Yeah, sure, you're running in the right direction, but you're not focusing on the end point. You're focusing on here and now, just this step, just this step. In Japanese, tada, just this, but you also find it in the, in the Pali and the Sanskrit, right? The tathata, right? When we're running the marathon, and I have to say, I haven't run marathon, but I'm talking to the friends of mine who have, and they say, yeah, this is what you have to do. You've got to focus on right here and now. You're approaching the goal because you're going in the right direction. But what it really comes down to is just this step, just this step, just this step. And of course, that's what our practice has always encouraged, right? Keeping to the here and now. So that's part of the meaning of non-attachment to result. But I think there's a couple more things important to say. A marathon is a long race, but it still comes to an end, right? Sooner or later, if you do the whole thing. What about a path that has no end? There's no final point, no destination. What I'm thinking of here, of course, is what Chan and Zen students are often doing, because I remember in the Zen centers that I lived in, at least once a day, we would recite the 4 bodhisattva vows, right? And the first vow, and the most important, is living beings are numberless. I vow to save them all. Now, what saving means, that can be understood in different ways, traditionally helping them wake up, become enlightened, but there are many ways to help people. But what's interesting is the paradox, right? An infinite number, endless number of living beings, and I'm going to help them all. I'm taking a vow, a promise to myself to do something that cannot be achieved. Is that crazy or what? No, it's not crazy, because the point here is not about attaining the goal, but a reorientation of the meaning of our lives, right? Reorienting ourselves away from our usual self-preoccupation, which is, what's in this situation for me, to, turning around and asking, well, what can I do to promote the well-being of everyone, right? On a day-to-day level, what becomes important is not the unattainable goal, but what direction you're going in. And I think this is especially important when we think about ecological activism, because it can be so frustrating. But the point of this is to be on the bodhisattva path. Sure, there's going to be problems. Sometimes we'll be successful in what we're trying to do. That doesn't mean, oh, I've done it, now I can relax. Well, the point is there's always more. There will always be more. There's no end to that path. And if we're not successful, well, what do? Well, we dust ourselves off, maybe meditate a bit and try again, or maybe we try in a different way. But the point is there's this new orientation, this new direction. And the other thing I think that's important to emphasize here is that really, this can sound like a huge hassle, right? Oh my God, I have to do this. And it's not that way at all, right? I think once we realize our non-separation, our non-duality with other people and indeed with the earth, this is the way we want to live, right? We don't want to do anything else. This becomes our passion, our joy, our priority. But there's a third and final point about this non-attachment to result that stands out most of all for me. Let's be honest, right? The ecological crisis, and certainly the climate crisis, it's looking pretty bad, right? As most of you probably have read, this is the hottest year in recorded history, and it's pretty clear we're going to have hotter years in the future, right? Our ecological situation looks bad, and there's the very real possibility that whatever we do will be in vain. It won't be successful. It won't have enough of a result. Privately, and sometimes even in public, an increasing number of climate scientists are becoming rather pessimistic. We seem to be close to tipping points if we haven't already passed them. And it's very difficult to anticipate what's going to happen, but people speculate about the survival of civilization, even the survival of our species, if the temperatures get as bad as it looks like they might. We just don't know. We just don't know. We just don't know. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Isn't that something that our contemplative practices, that our meditation cultivates? Certainly in the Zen tradition, the idea of not knowing, there's the famous phrase from one of the koans, not knowing is most intimate, right? I'm thinking of the Zen Peacemaker order here in the US, very socially engaged. They have 3 tenets, and the first one is not knowing. The second one, bearing witness to the joys and sorrows of the world. And thirdly, taking actions that arise from not knowing and that bearing witness, right? The kind of not knowing that's envisaged here is one that makes us more spacious, right? We become more open, more aware of our own reactivity, more open to the perspective of others. it's not a fixed position, like not a fixed position, but it's more saying something about how we relate to the situation, the way that we engage with the world. We do the best we can, right? Engaging with the world as it seems to us. We don't know what's going to happen next, but we do the best we can, ready to change. If the situation changes, we're ready to change, and if our understanding of the situation changes, we're more flexible in that way, rather than having some kind of dogmatic worldview or idea. All of this, of course, in the service of what Yun Men said, responding appropriately. One of my early teachers, Robert Aiken in Hawaii, he liked to say that our task is not to clear up the mystery, but to make the mystery clear. Our task is not to clear up the mystery, but to make the mystery clear. So the spiritual path isn't about we have an experience and now we understand everything about how. No. It's opening up to this fundamental mystery of a world that's constantly changing, that we don't grasp it, right? The whole idea of the bodhisattva, well, the spiritual path generally, it's not as though we grasp the world, but it's more that we open up and for something to manifest through us. And indeed, I think that when we're engaged in ecological action, I often have the sense that because we're not separate from the earth, because we are part of the earth, that it is the earth working to heal itself when we open up and do the very best that we can beyond ego, right? So to be on this path, this mystery, which includes not knowing so much, it's not debilitating, but rather empowering, because it liberates us from dogmatism and fixed ideas about ourselves. So we do the best we can with that openness, that readiness to change when it's appropriate. Please note here that I'm not talking about being optimistic or pessimistic. I see those as a kind of dualistic form of thinking, where each sort of feeds on the other. My favorite definition of a pessimist, for example, it's someone who has had to live with an optimist. I mean, pessimism, optimism, it's like hope and despair. They're kind of head trips about the future, what will happen in the future, or what won't happen in the future, right? Both of them involve a kind of mental attachment to results, to some idea about the way the future would be. And bodhisattvas are not motivated to act out of that, out of fear. It's more a kind of compassionate generosity of spirit that just wants to express itself. And of course, we would like to have results, but those can't be guaranteed, and therefore maybe aren't necessary. I like what Joanna Macy has said about hope. Quote, "I find assuring people that there's hope, including myself, is not all that helpful. In Buddhism, there's no word for hope. It would be viewed as a distraction from what's at hand. I think all we can really affirm is where we want to put our attention. Each of us has a choice. Do we want to give up and surrender to the great unraveling, the way things are falling apart? Or do we want to join in with those working for a livable future? Since the outcome is uncertain, right? Don't know. We have to enjoy doing something exhilarating and useful without knowing for sure if it's going to work out." Wendell Berry, one of my favorite American writers, said, "We don't have a right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have the right to ask is, what is the right thing to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it?" Instead of that duality of hope and despair, I think the more important one is grief and the concept that goes along. Grief is connected with love, right? I saw once in downtown London, there's a little stone memorial to the victims of 9/11. And all it says on the memorial, very simple, it says, grief is the price we pay for love, right? Grief isn't a head trip about the future. Grief is, it's more bodily. It's something we feel here and now. And it's also, you could say, grief is the homage. It's the respect that we pay to what we love. We grieve for what we love. Martin Soul Reader put it very well. The world doesn't want to be saved, he says. The world does not want to be saved. It wants to be loved. That's how you save it. I love that. The world doesn't want to be saved. It wants to be loved. That's how we save it. So as I said, it's important that our activism be motivated fundamentally by love, not by fear, not by anger, not by despair. Anyway, all of this points what to me is the deepest meaning of non-attachment to results, of don't know mind in this time of world crisis, polycrisis. And for me, this is the most important thing that I can say tonight. Our task is to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do is going to make any difference whatsoever. Our job is to do the best we can, not knowing what the consequences will be. Have we already passed important tipping points and maybe civilization as we know it is doomed? We don't know. But it's not necessary that we know. It's okay that we don't know. Of course, there's intention in the sense that, yeah, we would like what we do to have an effect. Yet ultimately, what we do is our gift to each other and our gift to the earth. And, as you know, a gift ultimately, if we give a gift because we expect something in return, that's not a real gift. So again, the gift here is our non-attachment to results. We don't know, we can't know if what we do is important, but we do know that it's important for us to do it. Of course, to be so unattached to what we do, that's not easy, right? That's to set the bar very high, maybe unrealistically high. Maybe no one is able to embody that fully, that double practice of the bodhisattva. But that's okay. It's like our job isn't to be perfect, it's to do the very best we can. And here's the important thing. Remember, bodhisattvas are grounded in their own personal meditation practice. So when we feel frustrated, when we are attached, when things don't work out, and it's hard to let go, well, guess what? We have our meditation practice to help us do that. To end, and to be quite frank, it seems to me that if contemporary Buddhism doesn't want to follow this path that I've been talking about, then Buddhism isn't what the world needs right now. But of course, what I've tried to do in this talk is to highlight just how much Buddhism does have to offer that can help us understand and respond appropriately to our situation today, which, to quote Chomsky again, the most dangerous time in human history. And I think it's like all hands on deck. We're all being called upon today, to sort of let go of, our usual addictions or preoccupations and face this challenge. It requires us to transform the whole meaning of our lives. And I think that the situation we're in today calls for nothing less. So let me stop at that.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I find myself nodding my head with you almost every sentence. And I hear a little bit of echoing. I hope it's not. Okay, so I do have some questions, but I will leave it first to Professor Rowley to respond to this amazing talk. And so, Steve, are you?
Sorry, I'm having trouble with my mic here.
No problem.
Great. Let's see. There we go. Well, thank you so much, David, for such an inspiring talk. Like Jaru, I was nodding all the time, constantly, and just really feeling very calmed by your presentation, not only what you said, but how you said it. I think the spirit that you presented this information and wisdom to us was evident in the way you did it, which was quite beautiful, I thought. And so I should say that I think in the introduction it was clear I'm not a Buddhist or a Buddhist practitioner, of course, but I've always been fascinated and attracted to it as a kind of source of ideas and wisdom that does, as you said in so many ways, complement many other traditions and many other commentators, including Chomsky. But the one that came to mind to me at the end when you said that the most important thing we can do is to do the right thing, regardless of whether we know it will be effective or not, to be detached from the results of our actions, but to do the best we can in a situation that, as Chomsky said, is so precarious and becoming more so. So I should say I happened to go yesterday to the San Francisco Asian Art Museum, which has brought the very famous Zen Sung Chen master's painting of the six persimmons. And so I took my classes to see it, and it's all beautifully displayed in a room with also lots of photos of the temple where it's sat for the last 600 years or so. And it so happened that the museum was also featuring the work of that contemporary Japanese artist. I don't know if you know of him, Murakami Takashi, who specializes in kind of monstrous, all sorts of bizarre art, essentially. And so I had my students go to both. And at the end, I asked them which one they liked better. And most of them said the persimmons. So even though there were a lot of kind of otaku types who do appreciate sort of pop culture from Japan, but that kind of made me a little bit hopeful, I guess, that this very beautiful, simple, really wonderful culture of 13th century Chan does have an impact today as well on young minds who are perhaps, we often I think, as teachers, despair, right, that our students are so distracted now by all of the media. It's the the entanglement in the digital world that they seem to be plunging ever deeper into. And we try to pull them out, but sometimes it seems like a Herculean task. But it gave me hope that I think with the right stimuli, young minds in particular are receptive to information and guidance. And so I don't claim to be an Ecosattva, but I find myself increasingly in my own teaching as a teacher, trying to point out, the many delusions that you were talking about, that through propaganda and advertising, as you say, everything, the consumerist culture that's so enticing to many. I'm find myself, constantly trying to find ways of showing and telling how young people can try to avoid some of those traps that are preventing us, I think, in many ways, from looking directly and unflinchingly at the reality that if we don't perceive, we won't be able to do anything about. We really have to look this situation squarely. And as Bill McKibben, another hero, start to think not as an individual but collectively, and to find solidarity both in the immediate surroundings of our communities, but across the myriad world beings that we share this universe with. So I've been trying lots of ways, experimenting, not so much with religion or spiritual practices in my case, but finding, especially in the Japanese tradition, of organic farming and sort of rediscovering the connection to the basic, not only the soil but the natural ingredients that are sustaining us. And so I'm increasingly trying to do that with my students and introduce Japanese culture, Japanese history, Japanese literature through that lens, and hopefully making an impact. But I don't know. I think your approach of really kind of showing and embodying that sense of calm and just the wonderful way that you express yourself is probably the most effective way to turn minds in the direction of thinking of how they can start to, if not make a difference, at least do the right thing and be oriented in that direction. Your point about, all these ideas are wonderful. What struck me about your comment on grief and love, I don't know if you know of there were a lot of 18th century Japanese thinkers, not so much in the Buddhist tradition, but in the Kokugaku, who talked about this idea that yes, grief is what makes us human. I think we all sort of intuitively sense that it's really in moments of grief that we can express our humanity and our compassion and love most directly, most without any pretense, anything that obstructs that. And that I think is something that we have to nurture too, because our culture today, turns away from death and destruction. It struck me particularly in the situation right now going on in Israel and Gaza that I just don't understand how people can turn away from that. To me, it's something that we have to face very directly and feel. I mean, how can you not feel the intense grief of so many people dying so quickly and so horribly? And we have to nurture that. I guess it's really compassion as well as the ability to grieve not only those to whom we have some connection, but the entire universe of living and non-living beings who deserve our compassion and grief as well. I mean, as you say, the infinitude of our world is something that we have to, as aspiring bodhisattvas, dedicate our existence to. So those are just a few random thoughts. I'm sure the audience here has much more informed a lot of what you've said. So let me turn it over to everybody to ask questions.
Could I just thank you and say one thing about grief first, because I really appreciate your picking up on that. Um, I think the problem for a lot of us who are aware of the ecological crisis and the other is that we're kind of afraid of our grief, afraid to feel it, and it often gets confused with despair. Um, and a really important part of the Eco-Dharma retreats that I sometimes co-teach is helping people get in touch with their grief and feeling it, that really is essential as far as transforming, I think, our focus. Um, and in my own case, and I think not just for me, uh, I think it's important that that grief is always a part of me. It's not the main thing usually that's going on, but the grief to me is a constant reminder, not to get caught up in all the addictive kind of things that our culture encourages us. And so in a kind of ironic way, I appreciate, I kind of love my grief. I depend on it in a way to keep me focused on what's really important. And so I appreciate your picking up on that. Thank you.
Can I jump in very quickly because you both are on the topic of a grief, and within eco-criticism discourses, there's a lot of discussion about climate anxiety, grief, and all kinds of affects.
Hmm.
And you could, I think one direction to think about it is a form of climate denial. It's not allowing oneself, if you sink into the grief and you're actually acknowledging it. So it's probably a form of not keeping distance, right? I don't want to get into that direction. And could also be, I wonder if it's too close to nihilism, the feeling of this nihilistic nihilism, despair,
Yeah.
right? And it makes me think about Roy Scranton's book again. What is it? How to die in the Anthropocene or something like that. And anyway, so he is arguing that we have to die before we rise again, right? So we have to allow us to really sink down, in order to come back, to renew our energy. Otherwise, we just got stuck there. And I think Buddhism, and this is, I wonder, maybe I can turn that into a question to Professor Lloyd. And how would the Buddhist teaching of emptiness, because you talk a lot about the lack, right? The lack is so close to existential sort of nihilistic feeling, right? You feel just so, in a way that we sort of revisit, existentialism, like maybe almost 100 years ago, or or the sort of the Kyoto school, or maybe much later, and also the Kyoto school after the post-war, right? That intellectuals start to reflect the civilization sort of collapse, right? During the two wars, after two wars. So are we sort of in a historical sort of return, going back again? Is it the time for us to rethink about Buddhism? Because back then they are trying to use Buddhism, right? The Kyoto school to think about our civilization crisis. So I wonder what's your thought on that, the use of the reflection about, some of the emptiness, right? And I think one of the way that you actually articulate so beautifully is the idea of not knowing. It's a way, probably it's an answer to climate denial, to the climate, all kinds of climate forms of denial, by teaching us to throw in the state of not knowing and be okay with it. So, and I wonder if you have anything to say about, like, shunyata, what else shunyata can offer if Buddhism wants to be, sort of a tool for our climate crisis.
That is such a wonderful and important question, but also such a big one that I'm a little intimidated. I'm not totally sure where to start, except, I think that we can think about the practice of non-attachment as really the practice of emptiness, right? Letting go, letting go. Attachment is kind of the opposite. We cling to things, and the way the mind works, we seize on things in a way that objectifies them, gives them a separate reality, and also, like Yogacara says, that act of grasping also objectifies or reifies the sense of a self that's doing the grasping. So the process of meditation in letting go and the not knowing, I think that's a profound exercise in emptiness. The emptiness of our thoughts, the emptiness of our opinions, the emphasis of the letting go of all of the usual characteristics that compose the sense of self and how we understand ourselves. So maybe that's the best short-term answer, is to emphasize how this practice that I was talking about, both in terms of the individual meditation, but also in terms of how it is that we engage, it's the application of emptiness so that we can act fully, being here and now, doing the very best we can, but allowing for that emptiness of the consequences that we don't simply know how they're going to play out, and we really can't control them. Yeah. I mean, there's so much to say about emptiness, but I'm a little worried about getting pretty heavy into physics and ontology there. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. I think that I think at this point we should open it to the floor and to see if anyone who has questions, please feel free to ask. Raise your hand, or you can type your question here. Hexing, please.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. Thanks for Professor Loyo's thought-provoking lecture. I am Hexing, a PhD candidate at Southwestern Jiao Tong University with Professor Hu Zhihong as my supervisor. And I'd like to ask a question about Zen, the term itself. During listening to Professor's lecture, I noticed that Chan and Zen can be changeable, but in fact, Zen that refers to Japanese Buddhism, but Chan, it's the Chinese Buddhism. And a scholar, American scholar, David Hinton, who translated a lot of Chinese classics into Western words, and in his translation, the Chinese character Chan, he always translated into Chan rather than Zen. And Zen Buddhism has made it clear that the fundamental text studied and the monastic regulations and daily rituals followed in monasteries across East and Southern Asia, as well as Europe, actually originated primarily in China. So my question is, Professor, do you think it's necessary to distinguish the connotations of Chan or Zen and Zen, or it can be as a topic of an article? This is my question. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Basically, The term Zen in Japanese is, as I understand it, just the Japanese way of pronouncing the same
Okay.
characters as Chan. Um,
Ah,
and I think it's generally acknowledged in Japan that Zen Buddhism is basically the same as Chan Buddhism. That
okay.
sometimes basically the same in terms of the fundamental teaching. One of the interesting things that Hinton talks about is, he has stressed something that I've suspected, that people sometimes say that Chan Buddhism is Buddhism that's a little bit influenced by Taoism, but
Yeah, that's
actually I
right.
think it's more Taoist in some ways than early Buddhist. Um, that conversation, that interaction is really important. But the other thing I would want to emphasize, the main differences, as I can see it, between Chan in China and Zen in Japan is Japanese culture is, from my own experience, I lived there quite a while, much more formal, much more regimented. When you think about the way that Zen is practiced in monasteries, it's very, very, very strict. And frankly, in my opinion, I think sometimes Japanese Zen Buddhists confuse what is Buddhist with what is Japanese. They're not always the same thing. It's their way of doing Buddhism, but it's not necessarily essentially Buddhist. And that's why it's so important to compare, because comparisons can help us see through some of the cultural overlay so that we can, it can help us work toward distinguishing and clarifying the true Dharma without getting totally caught up in any particular culture. Anyway, thank you for your question and comment.
Yeah, and
Thanks for your thought-provoking answer. Thanks.
yeah,
Helped me a lot.
yeah, and in Korea, it's called Song Buddhism. It's also Chan. So they
I get it.
different pronunciations in different languages. Yeah.
I get it. Thanks.
Come. And Yiping, this is Professor Liang from Taiwan Normal University, teacher Normal University. Professor Yiping, please.
Oh yes, thank you so much for your talk. Um, just simply listening to the talk is like, in a way, your talk was very slow and very calm. Just the process of listening to the talk was meditational. I was like reading slowly, getting myself into a state of peace, quiet, and calmness. So that was very, very soothing. So thank you for that. I don't practice Buddhism, but I find slowness to be really, really important and therapeutic. By nature, by birth, by personality, I am very fast-paced. So recently, I came to understand and appreciate a lot the fact. I mean, not the fact, but the beauty of slowness, and that also is what I learned in Tai Chi. That is, is something that's really, different from everything we have learned in a capitalistic and I mean, capitalistic and also industrialized society, that you have to quick, but then I guess this is something that's really, really important. So I wonder if you would like to say something, or your talk, your vision, or your yes, vision, right? I mean, so what is that, in relation to slowness, this notion of slowness? Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. And maybe I can feed your question into one more thing that I would like to add to my talk. My talk, I was saying a lot about how we do what we do, but as I emphasized, I didn't say what we should do, right? I didn't go into specifics because I don't think the Buddhist tradition can help us there. But I think there is a kind of practice, and I think it should be done slowly. That's where your comment comes in. I think there is a kind of practice that can actually help us answer this question and decide what it is that we should do. It's really a kind of three-part, you could call it a meditation, but you could also say it's a reflection, contemplation, three questions that we contemplate. And again, I think it should be done slowly, needs to be done slowly. Number one, what do I have to offer, taking into account everything about my situation today, you know, health, age, skills, am I retired? Do I need money? Da 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 da, who depends on me? But basically taking everything into account that affects what I am able to offer, what I am able to do. Number two, given what I have to offer, what are the good possibilities for me? Because of course, in this poly crisis, there are so many things that need to be done. And of course, if we try to do too many, we end up doing nothing. We'll just spread ourselves too thin. So the second question, really reflecting, again, slowly, what are the possibilities? And then finally, the third question, having reflected, having digested the first two questions, turning within and asking ourselves, what calls to me? What speaks to my heart? What do I really want to do? You know, going beyond ego, where does my love, how does my love for the world, how does it want to express itself? And this, I think, requires some kind of contemplative, slow, contemplative process where we open up and wait for something to, you know, bubble up, or maybe that's not, but for something to arise within us that clarifies what it is that we should focus on. So again, what do I have to offer? What are the good possibilities for me? And what really calls to me? What am I called to do? I think those three things can be really, really helpful, not only for individuals, but groups can discuss these too. Very, very helpful in helping us figure out how do we respond to this poly crisis. So thank you, Professor, for your
Sure. Yeah,
comment.
thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Hitanji, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. And I was just really interested when you said that meditation was a self-sharpening tool and that engagement with the world is essential for our spiritual path. I'm actually I'm like a novice. Like I just took this course for the first time and it's my first time dabbling in meditation. And I was curious, like, do you mean that if we meditate and let's say we're meditating on our actions and let's say we had a situation and we realized that we reacted poorly and we're meditating on how we reacted in that situation, how we felt, and we meditate on that, but the next day something similar comes up and you have a very similar reaction, but it occurs to a lesser degree. Would you call that progress, or would you say that's still would you say that's progress in getting rid of like our vasana, or would you say that's like we're not meditating the right way? And also I had like a second question, which was, to what degree would you classify like engagement with the world as appropriate versus knowing when you're too involved?
Yeah, thank you for those. First question, I think what you're talking about is a good example of the self-sharpening sword in that engagement in the world, right? We have relations with other people and sometimes things go badly. And then in our that encourages us in our meditation to reflect, what did I do wrong? Why did I react in that way? And so in the future, when a situation like that comes up again, our response may not, our reactivity may not be as strong, but also there might be a stronger sense of freedom so that we don't need to react in that way at all. There's more, the mind is more spacious. So I think that your comment is, your example is quite a good one. That self-sharpening sword, I think, can work in a number of ways, but I think that's one of the primary ways. Yeah. Regarding engagement in the world, your question seemed to be asking, can we be too engaged? I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind there, but it seems to me this touches on exactly the emphasis on non-attachment to results. That if the only way that I can understand being too engaged is if we're too concerned emotionally about achieving a certain kind of result, and then we're going to get into some kind of trouble. The mind is clinging, and there's going to be a lot of dukkha. So I think the point of the bodhisattva keeping the contemplative side, the meditative side, which is expressed in the non-attachment, I think that can help us avoid that kind of problem, if I understand what you're referring to.
Yeah, that was exactly what I meant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Chelsea, please.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much for a really wonderful talk. I wanted to ask, do you think that spiritual activism can coexist with the rise that we're seeing of artificial intelligence? Do you think that they're competing or complementary forces?
Great question. I wish I knew the answer. It's interesting. There is going to be some Buddhist teachers are invited. Next week, we're actually going to have a meeting with somebody in the AI world. We're going to talk about precisely this question. And the reality is, I don't really know enough about AI to really understand the dangers there. I can't see how it would negate the importance of our activism, of our social and ecological activism. But the reality is I don't really understand it well enough. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate hearing your opinion.
Any other question? Yalan, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. This is, I'm a huge fan of yours, so that's so. I'm so grateful for listening to your talk. And actually, I have a question. This is about the identity politics. I think I follow Jalu's concern about when we have the last eco talk. How do you perceive the tension? Maybe I'm not sure whether this is a tension or not. Okay, between the concept of non-self in Buddhism and the emphasis on identity politics, which often revolves around asserting or celebrating individual and the collective identities, such as in some like feminism or other isms. Okay, so I'm
BIPOC,
curious about how do you think about that? Thank you.
It's a really good question, isn't it? Because as you say, the implication of Buddhist practice seems to imply letting go of ourselves, right? In modern language, we can say the sense of self is a psychological and social construct. And what Buddhist practice seems to be saying is, in our meditation, we let go, we deconstruct and reconstruct this sense of self. And that would seem to go beyond any identity, right? Whether you're straight or gay, white or person of color. So that's a really important question. And the only thing that I notice that I can say here is that I'm trying to remember the scholar who wrote a book, and he said in order to lose yourself, you have to have a strong sense of self. You have to have a healthy sense of self. That's what he said, right? And the reality is, of course, especially people who've experienced depression of different sorts, such as gay people, transgender, BIPOC, very often they have been suffering from so much, so many problems that you could say their sense of self is not very healthy. They need to sort of fix their identity first before they can lose it. That there's actually a role, I think, and you could call it a kind of intermediate role of, acknowledging, celebrating, what it means to be a person of color, what it means to be gay or transgender. That I can see that as an important part of this larger process of healing that we need to go through. So that's the sense in which I think. Well, it's. Let me add one more thing. I remember when I started Zen practice in Hawaii, a long time ago now. Many of us at that time, we thought, we're talking early 70s now, revealing how old I am here. Many of us thought, oh, this is the most incredible thing, and everyone's going to want to do this. And if we just sit, meditate long enough, then all of our psychological problems will be solved. They will just disappear. They will evaporate. Well, it doesn't always work like that. And I think one of the really important things we've discovered over the last generation is that there is a role for therapy, especially if you're fortunate to get a therapist who's sympathetic, to something like meditation and Buddhism. There are psychological issues that, okay, maybe if we meditate our whole lives, maybe then, but maybe not. It might well be the case that there are other types of psychotherapy that can be extremely helpful, especially in coordination with something like meditation. So in a way, that kind of follows from what you said, I think, that it's important not to think of, say, Zen meditation as sort of the only practice and that'll take care of everything. Many of us are traumatized. Many of us are suffering in many different ways. And there are other types of practices that can be very, very helpful in alleviating our dukkha. And so I think we shouldn't be so absolute that we don't acknowledge and appreciate and benefit from them. Is that a kind of answer?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks for your question. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that question very much because I think identity politics is really complicated. It's on the one hand, it's so important to empower the minorities, right? On the other hand, the world problem actually is created by all identity politics, so it's just like there's no easy, black and white answer. And yeah, and also non-identity are sort of important in a way to help, so they're the pros and cons of both sides, I guess. Well, I thank everybody for coming tonight to this wonderful talk. Okay, so yeah, and I hope that Professor Loy will come back in the future to our Eco Talk series. Yeah, yeah, wonderful. And thanks everyone, and I'll see you next semester. Okay, bye.
Thank you, everyone. Be well.
Yeah, and thanks, Steve.
Thank you,
For doing
Stephen.
a great job.
Professor
Yeah.
Chang.
Yeah, thank you.